Hello and welcome to this module in which we'll see a very concise historical overview on how Linux came about. This is a very important module to get to grips with the ideological ideas that Linux and its makers try to get across to the world. We will talk about the beginnings of Linux, the reason why there are so many different distributions, and where Linux stands at the moment. But before we do that, I would like to introduce Henry. Every now and then, Henry will step in and try to support me with whiteboard drawings and texts to better explain what we're discussing. Hopefully he will be supportive in this, not only for clarification, but also to avoid death by PowerPoint. So I might call on him from time to time. Now, first let's have a look at how Linux came about. A very important date in the history of computing is the 1st of January 1970. This was the day that Unix, mind you, Unix and not Linux, was officially born. Unix was pretty revolutionary in that it was the first operating system that was multitasking and multi-user. This means that a single operating system was able to execute multiple tasks at the same time, and also it allowed for multiple users to log in to the same system concurrently. This date is still used in Linux to determine the time in quite a few calculations. Unix was a major success and got embraced by many tech companies who all created their own version of it. For example, Hewlett-Packard started with lpic1, as did IBM with AIX, Sun Microsystems with Sonos, and even Microsoft initiated their own version called Xenix. And there were more. The only drawback of this way of computing to some people was the fact that when you bought a machine of any of the mentioned companies, the software was under that company's control and could not be modified by you. So the only thing a customer could do was to run the operating environment but not change it. And if there were things that weren't okay, that particular customer would have to wait until HP or IBM, for example, made improvements and then upgrade to a newer version. Then Richard Stallman came along. Richard Stallman did not like that the software was proprietary and that he couldn't modify it. In the beginning of the 1980s, he started the GNU project that began creating all these Unix commands and programs on its own. The idea behind this was that Stallman wanted software to be free. By free, he meant that the software was not owned by a single person or company. The freedom of this software could be guaranteed by not only offering the programs as they were, but also the source code of all these programs. So a user could modify the code and run it through a program called a compiler to generate the machine code. So you could say that this software was free, in other words, owned by nobody. Stallman was not the only important person. Another major contributor was Linus Torvalds, who, being a student in Finland in 1991, he published his kernel. Now this kernel may be a new term to you, so let's have a quick look at that. And we will need Henry for this. So let's say a computer is nothing but a bunch of hardware. Say there would be a processor called a CPU, there would be a disk device, there'd be random access memory or RAM in which you could run programs, and a network device in the form of a network interface card or NIC. And as you know, there's more hardware than just the above mentioned. A kernel is a program that is able to communicate with the hardware and manage this hardware. So the kernel is started just after you power on the computer and starts managing the hardware in many ways. We will go into more detail later, but for now we leave it at this. So with the endeavors of Stallman and Torvalds, we had a complete operating system environment with a kernel and tools. People were able to obtain the source code of the programs that they wanted to run and compile them after downloading. This was a pretty complex business, so really developers and engineers would be able to do that. This limited the distribution to very technical users and definitely not to others. Then some companies and organizations came up with the idea to group all of this software in selectable sets and offered these groupings as a working environment for every user that also wanted to run the software. And the organizations that offered a working set of tools were said to be creating Linux distributions or distros. Some of the initial distros were Slackware, Debian and Red Hat. Mind you, nowadays there are many more distributions, most of which are based on one of the originals. These are called forks because they originate in Slackware, Debian or Red Hat or others, and they themselves can also be used to fork other distros from. Finally, there's another term that's often used with regards to free software. This is open source software. Linux is said to be under the open source license. This means that developers of software can share this software with others, but they will have to make the source code available as well. And also, the developer cannot forbid others to redistribute and or modify the software. So, in a sense, this resembles the idea of free software to a certain extent. Some of the most popular distributions today are Red Hat, SUSE, Ubuntu and Mint, very user-friendly, but this is always a personal preference, of course. Fact is that Linux in any shape or form is all around and can be found not only on computers but also on devices that you would not expect to be running Linux. So Linux is here to stay. Now, in summary, we've seen that Linux was derived from Unix. So it's important to state that Linux is not Unix, but it's a Unix-like operating system. Another important feature is that there is a notion of free software and open source, advocated by people like Richard Stallman and Linus Torvalds. And because of the fact that the software is open source, there are many distributions. To find out more about that, please check DistroWatch. Thank you for taking this module, and if you have any questions, please contact us.